A sealed tomb whispers a warning across 3,000 years. Tonight, we are not here to fear the Pharaoh's curse, but to listen to its story as a gentle, mysterious lullaby from a distant past. You will leave this journey feeling deeply relaxed, carrying a new sense of peace about one of history's greatest puzzles. We will uncover why a king's rest was so fiercely protected and explore the simple, human truth behind the legend of swift wings and doom. What does a quiet tomb truly wish to tell us if we only listen with calm hearts? The sun was a soft orange ember sinking behind the western cliffs of the Valley of the Kings. A deep purple shadow crept across the desert floor, bringing a profound silence that had reigned here for centuries. It was in this quiet hour of November 4th, 1922, that a man named Howard Carter stood before a discovery that would echo through time. His team had been working for years, sifting through the dust and stone of this arid valley, driven by a fading hope. Then, beneath the ruins of some ancient workmen's huts, they found it. A single step cut into the bedrock, leading down into the darkness. The air must have been still, charged with a breathless anticipation as they cleared more sand, revealing a sealed doorway stamped with the necropolis seal. This was not just any tomb. It was an intact burial, a royal time capsule sealed since the boy King Tutankhamun was laid to rest. Carter peered at that sealed door, a barrier between his world and one untouched for over 3,000 years. In the growing dusk, with the desert coolness settling around him, he stood on the precipice of a mystery that would captivate the world, a silent secret waiting patiently in the sand. Deep within that sealed corridor, waiting in the dark, was a message. On a magic brick placed to guard the burial chamber and on a statue of the god Anubis were words carved in elegant hieroglyphs. A simple, powerful sentence meant to guard a king's eternal sleep. It reads, "Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the peace of the king." Let the sound of these words drift through your mind. Death, depicted as a vulture goddess with vast, sheltering wings, swift wings like a falcon diving from the sky. To him who disturbs, a phrase showing a person's hand breaking a seal or opening a door. The peace of the king, the sacred silence and perfect order of the Pharaoh's afterlife. This was not a malicious spell cast into the world. Think of it instead as a solemn prayer whispered in stone. It was a spiritual shield, an appeal to the gods to protect the profound tranquility of this sacred space. It was a final, hopeful wish from a culture that believed peace in the next life was the ultimate reward. So when we hear of this curse, we are not hearing a threat. We are listening to an ancient, heartfelt plea for a young king to be left in peace, a lullaby carved in stone to ensure his dreams remained unbroken. Yet the story of the curse truly began not with a whisper from the tomb, but with a song from a bird. Howard Carter kept a pet canary, a small, bright yellow bird whose cheerful singing had filled his house in the valley, a stark contrast to the silent desert around them. Shortly after that first step was discovered, a cobra entered the canary's cage and ate it. Now, in the dry heat of Egypt, a cobra entering a home is not a supernatural event. But to the local workmen, it was a sign of immense power. The cobra was the uraeus, the sacred serpent worn on the crown of the pharaoh, a living symbol of divine royalty. They saw this not as a random act of nature, but as a deliberate message. The royal serpent had come to consume the songbird that had heralded the discovery of the king's resting place. It was a story so perfectly poetic, so rich with symbolic meaning, that it spread like wildfire. This single, natural event became the first brick in the wall of the curse's legend, transforming a biological coincidence into a perceived omen of doom. It was not a curse, but a story waiting to be told, a narrative woven from the threads of fear, symbolism, and the human need to find patterns in the unknown. The legend of the curse truly took flight with the passing of a single man. Lord Carnarvon, the English aristocrat who had funded the search for years, was the public face of the discovery alongside Howard Carter. Months after the tomb was opened, in the spring of 1923, he fell ill in Cairo. The cause was a seemingly minor infection, a mosquito bite on his cheek that he had accidentally nicked while shaving. The bite became septic, leading to blood poisoning and pneumonia. It was a tragic, yet medically understandable, chain of events in an era before antibiotics. But the timing was everything. He died less than 6 months after stepping into the antechamber of Tutankhamun's tomb. The world, already captivated by the discovery, now had a perfect story. Newspapers across the globe seized upon the narrative, transforming a personal tragedy into a sensational headline. They declared Lord Carnarvon the curse's first victim, a man struck down by the Pharaoh's vengeance for disturbing his eternal rest. In an instant, the ancient plea for peace was twisted into a modern tale of supernatural revenge, and a media myth was born that would outlive all of them. But the story of the curse did not end with Lord Carnarvon. In the years that followed, the deaths of others connected to the expedition were woven into the legend, creating a chain of coincidences that seemed, to a superstitious public, like undeniable proof. Take George J. Goode, the American railroad magnate. He was a wealthy tourist who visited the tomb in 1923, driven by the same fascination that gripped the world. He fell ill shortly after his visit and died of pneumonia in the French Riviera. Then there was Arthur Mace, a key member of Carter's team. It was Mace who had helped Carter force open the sealed doorway to the burial chamber. He suffered from poor health for years, a condition likely aggravated by the dust and exhaustion of the long excavation. He gradually weakened and passed away in 1928, not from a sudden curse, but from a slow physical decline. Even Archibald Douglas Reed, the radiologist who merely X-rayed the mummy before its examination, died a few years later from a disease linked to his constant, unprotected exposure to X-ray radiation. When you line up these events, a pattern seems to emerge, but look closer and a different picture comes into focus. These were individuals living in an age of limited medical science, exposed to unknown bacteria in a confined space, or suffering from pre-existing conditions. Their fates were tragic, yet medically explainable. The human mind is a pattern-seeking machine, especially in the face of the unknown. We connect dots that were never meant to be linked, creating a story of supernatural vengeance from a simple, sad sequence of natural ends. Perhaps the most grounded explanation for the curse lies not in magic but in microbiology. For over 3,000 years, the tomb of Tutankhamun remained a sealed environment. Within that dark, airtight space, organic offerings left for the king's journey, including food, perfumed oils, and flowers, slowly decayed. Scientists now suggest this process could have cultivated unique biological agents. Ancient bacteria or mold spores might have lain dormant in the dust and the sealed containers, waiting for the outside air that rushed in when the tomb was breached. Imagine breathing in air that had not been circulated for millennia, air laden with microscopic organisms to which modern immune systems had no resistance. A simple lung infection from such a source would have been a formidable threat in the 1920s. Furthermore, explorers noted a strange, dark powder covering many surfaces in the tomb. Analysis later suggested this could have been bat guano, accumulated over centuries. If present in large quantities, this material can release toxic levels of ammonia gas, a powerful irritant that can damage the lungs and eyes. So the curse, in a very real sense, could have been a physical one. It was not a spiritual vengeance, but a natural, if unfortunate, consequence of breaking into a sealed ecosystem. The wings of death were not those of a goddess, but the silent, invisible flight of spores and bacteria awakened from their long slumber. But there is another, more startling theory that whispers from the tomb's shadows. Some researchers have quietly suggested the presence of a different kind of ancient power, one that is invisible and silent. Could the Egyptians have unknowingly used materials that were radioactive? The vibrant paints that adorned the tomb walls and the beautiful artifacts within were made from ground minerals and ochres. Some of these natural pigments, like the yellow derived from uranium-bearing minerals or certain clays, can contain trace amounts of radioactive elements. Over the course of 3,000 years, sealed in a confined space with no ventilation, even low levels of radiation could have accumulated to a point of having a subtle biological effect. Imagine a constant, faint emission of energy from the very walls and objects, an unseen force field born from the earth itself. This is not a curse of magic, but a slow, geological consequence. For those who spent long hours inside the tomb, breathing the still air, this prolonged exposure could have theoretically weakened their cellular defenses, making them more susceptible to illness. While this theory remains speculative and is not the primary explanation, it adds a profound layer to the mystery. It suggests that the pharaoh's protection may not have been a spell cast by priests, but a natural property of the very stones and colors they used to build his eternal home. The wings of death in this light were not swift at all, but moved with the imperceptible slowness of atomic decay, a final, natural guardian for the king's long sleep. Perhaps the most potent curse of all was not written in hieroglyphs or hidden in the tomb's dust. It lived inside the human mind. When the newspapers began to print sensational stories of the mummy's revenge, they planted a powerful seed of suggestion in the public consciousness. This seed grew into a deep-seated fear, and fear has a profound way of shaping our reality. Think of a time you felt a sudden chill after hearing a ghost story, your body reacting to the tale as if it were a physical truth. This is the power of expectation. In medicine, this phenomenon is known as the nocebo effect, the dark twin of the more familiar placebo effect. Where a placebo can make you feel better because you believe a harmless sugar pill is medicine, the nocebo can make you feel ill or even manifest real physical symptoms simply because you believe you have been exposed to something harmful. A person who truly believed in the pharaoh's curse, who had internalized the story of swift wings and doom, might walk through the tomb with a sense of dread. Their heart might race, their breath might quicken, their mind might become hyper-aware of every minor ache or sniffle. A simple headache could be interpreted as the first sign of the curse's fatal touch. The body, listening intently to the worried whispers of the mind, can begin to write the very story it fears. So the curse became a self-fulfilling prophecy for some, not through magic, but through the incredible and sometimes terrifying power of our own belief. It was a story written not by ancient priests, but by the modern human brain, a testament to how a narrative, once believed, can truly take flight. Yet in the midst of all this talk of curses and coincidences, we often forget the central figure of this story. Who was this young king whose silent rest was so dramatically interrupted? Tutankhamun was a boy of perhaps 8 or 9 years old when he was crowned Pharaoh of Egypt. His world was not one of golden treasures, but of immense responsibility and political turmoil. He inherited a kingdom in disarray, following the radical religious revolution of his father, Akhenaten, who had abandoned Egypt's traditional gods. The boy king's original name was Tutankhamun, meaning the living image of the Aten, his father's sole god. But upon taking the throne, he and his advisors restored the old ways, changing his name to Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun, the king of the gods. Imagine the weight on those young shoulders, the pressure to heal a fractured nation and mend its spiritual heart. His reign was short, perhaps only 9 or 10 years. He was a teenager learning to rule when his life was cut short. We see no grand military conquests carved on his tomb walls. Instead, the story of his life is told through the beautiful, personal objects that surrounded him in death, not as a fearsome ruler, but as a young man. Look at the simple, elegant wooden chests, the gaming boards meant for leisure, the finely crafted bows he would have trained with. One of the most touching artifacts is a small, simple wreath of faded flowers, likely placed around his mummy's neck by his young widow in a final, grieving gesture. These are not the trappings of a vengeful spirit, but the quiet remnants of a life interrupted. The golden mask that has become his face to the world shows a serene, youthful beauty, a portrait of peace, not a grimace of anger. The curse was meant to protect his peace, and in these objects we can finally see what that peace was meant to be. A young king's hope for a tranquil eternity, surrounded by the simple, beautiful things that spoke of the life he barely had time to live. This quiet tomb was never meant to be a prison of dread, but a sacred gateway. For the ancient Egyptians, the burial chamber was the most holy of spaces, a carefully constructed vessel designed to carry the soul safely into eternity. It was called the House of Eternity, a name that speaks not of finality, but of a glorious, unending beginning. Within its sealed walls, every object, every painting, every single inscription served a single, profound purpose: to guide and protect the king's spirit on its perilous journey to the afterlife. The world of the dead was not a void, but a landscape filled with both wonders and dangers. The soul had to navigate dark caverns, face strange gods, and answer for its earthly life before it could reach the field of reeds, a paradise of peace and abundance. The tomb, therefore, was a spiritual launchpad stocked with all the knowledge, spells, and physical supplies the pharaoh would need to succeed. The food was real sustenance for the spirit, the games were for eternal leisure, and the golden treasures were not mere wealth, but symbols of divine, incorruptible flesh. This entire complex system was built on a principle of Ma'at, the cosmic order of truth, balance, and harmony. To break the seal, to let in the noise and light of the living world, was to shatter that perfect, delicate balance. The so-called curse was not born from a pharaoh's anger, but from a culture's deepest fear, the terror that this sacred, protective process would be interrupted, leaving the soul lost and vulnerable for all time. The plea for peace was the most heartfelt wish they could inscribe, a final prayer that the king's journey would continue uninterrupted forever. The true architect of the pharaoh's curse was not an ancient priest, but the modern printing press. In the 1920s, newspapers were the kings of information, and they were ravenous for a story that would sell copies. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb was a global sensation, a gift from the sands of time, but it was a silent, still mystery. What the public craved was drama, movement, and danger, and so the storytellers went to work. Reporters who had never set foot in the Valley of the Kings began to weave a narrative of supernatural vengeance. They took the natural death of Lord Carnarvon and transformed it into a cornerstone of their epic. Some accounts claimed that at the precise moment he died, all the lights in Cairo mysteriously flickered out. Others wrote that back in England, his faithful dog let out a single mournful howl and dropped dead simultaneously. These details were perfect, poetic, and almost entirely fabricated. They were the kind of embellishments that turned a tragic coincidence into an irresistible myth. The public, eager to believe in a world still touched by magic and mystery, devoured every word. This was not a deliberate conspiracy to deceive, but a reflection of a media ecosystem driven by circulation numbers. A story about a fascinating archaeological find was good, but a story about a cursed archaeological find that killed people was front-page news. The legend grew not from the tomb's dust, but from the ink staining the newsprint, a tale spun for an audience desperate to be thrilled. This power of storytelling fundamentally reshaped our perception of history. We do not remember the Tutankhamun excavation as a careful, scientific endeavor led by a meticulous man like Howard Carter. We remember it as the story of the cursed mummy's tomb. The narrative, once unleashed, took on a life of its own, proving that a compelling story can often overshadow a simple truth. It makes you wonder how much of what we accept as history is actually just the most popular story, the one that was told the loudest and most often, rather than the one that is most accurate. The man who stood at the very heart of the discovery, who broke the final seal and first laid eyes on the king's treasures, should have been the curse's primary victim. Yet Howard Carter lived for nearly 17 more years, a steadfast voice of reason who dismissed the supernatural tales with a scientist's calm conviction. While newspapers spun stories of swift-winged death, Carter continued his meticulous work within the tomb, day after day, year after year, surrounded by the very dust and artifacts said to carry the Pharaoh's vengeance. He catalogued thousands of objects with a quiet dedication, his health remaining largely robust long after the deaths that fueled the legend. His own survival is the most compelling and often overlooked evidence against the curse. He was not a man protected by magic, but by simple logic and a profound understanding of his own work. He saw the tomb for what it was, a magnificent archaeological site, not a chamber of horrors. Carter understood that the real threats were physical, the oppressive heat, the ever-present dust, the potential for accidents in a confined space. He faced these real dangers with preparation and care, not with superstitious fear. His longevity stands as a quiet, powerful testament against the myth. While the public wanted a story of ancient magic, Carter offered the far more reassuring truth of mundane reality. He was the calm at the center of the storm, a man who heard the whispers of a curse and simply went back to work, proving through his own long life that the greatest power often lies not in fearing the unknown, but in patiently seeking to understand it. The legend of the curse, once confined to newspapers and whispered rumors, soon found a far more powerful and permanent home. It flickered to life on the silver screen, transforming from a historical mystery into a cinematic spectacle. A decade after Tutankhamun's tomb was opened, Boris Karloff's iconic portrayal in The Mummy gave the legend a face and a form. No longer was it an invisible force or a simple warning. It was a reanimated priest, Imhotep, wrapped in decaying bandages, his burning eyes filled with a terrifying, singular purpose. This was not the nuanced story of a boy king's plea for peace. This was a tale of forbidden love and supernatural revenge, designed to send chills down the spines of a captivated audience. The film, and the many that followed, took the core ingredients of the real discovery, the sealed tomb, the ancient warnings, the untimely deaths, and amplified them into a thrilling and entirely fictional narrative. These stories were not concerned with historical accuracy. They were built to entertain, to make us gasp in the dark of the theater. They created a new kind of curse, one driven by a mummy's relentless, shuffling gait, a far cry from the swift wings of the original inscription. This cinematic version was so potent, so visually unforgettable, that it began to overwrite the real history in the public imagination. For generations, the word mummy would not conjure an image of a carefully prepared body on a spiritual journey, but of a monster emerging from a sarcophagus, its arms outstretched. The curse had been reborn, not in an Egyptian valley, but in the dream factories of Hollywood, and its shadow would stretch for decades. Later films, from the Technicolor adventures of the 1950s to the big-budget blockbusters of the 1990s, continued to play with this formula. They turned archaeologists into dashing heroes, tombs into booby-trapped labyrinths, and the curse into a plot device to raise the stakes. These stories are fun, exhilarating echoes of a real event, but they are echoes all the same. They are the campfire tales spun from the threads of a much quieter, more human truth. They remind us that some mysteries are simply too compelling to leave buried in the sand, and that we will always be tempted to dress them up in bandages and give them a menacing glow in their eyes. This misunderstood legend, for all its sensationalism, quietly planted a vital seed of conscience within the field of archaeology. The public's fascination with the curse and its underlying discomfort with disturbing the dead slowly evolved into a more profound question: should we be opening these tombs at all? The story forced both explorers and the watching world to confront the ethical weight of such discoveries. It was no longer enough to simply extract treasures and ship them off to distant museums. The narrative of a curse, however fictional, highlighted a sacredness that had been overlooked, a deep cultural belief that these were not merely graves but eternal homes. From this reflection, a new principle began to emerge, one of stewardship over ownership, of preservation over plunder. Modern archaeologists now approach a site like Tutankhamun's with a reverence that would have seemed foreign to the treasure hunters of a previous century. Their tools are not just brushes and trowels, but non-invasive ground-penetrating radar and delicate chemical analyzers meant to protect as much as to reveal. Every object is studied in context, its position and relationship to other items carefully documented, because the true story is not just in the artifact itself, but in the silent conversation it has with the space around it. The focus has shifted from the gold and the glory to the human being at the center of it all. We now seek to understand the person, their culture, their beliefs, and their journey. This respectful approach is the curse's most unexpected and positive legacy. A myth born from fear and fiction ultimately helped teach us to listen more carefully to the past, to hear not a threat in the dark, but a request for dignity from across the centuries. The real magic is not in a mummy's revenge, but in this hard-won understanding, a promise to let the silent stories rest even as we strive to learn from them. Yet the story of sacred warnings does not belong to Tutankhamun alone. Far to the north, standing guard on the Giza Plateau, the Great Sphinx holds its own profound silence. This colossal creature, with the body of a lion and the head of a king, has gazed eastward for millennia, its stone eyes witnessing the slow march of countless generations. And just like the sealed tomb in the Valley of the Kings, whispers of a protective power surround this monument. Ancient texts and local folklore speak of a guardian spirit residing within the Sphinx, a force that watches over the sacred plateau. There are tales not of vengeful curses, but of a deep, resonant energy that emanates from the very stone, a hum of antiquity that can overwhelm those who approach with disrespect. One such story tells of the Pharaoh Thutmose IV, who, as a young prince, fell asleep in the Sphinx's shadow. In a dream, the statue itself spoke to him, promising him the throne of Egypt if he would clear the sand that had buried it to its shoulders. He did, and he became king. This is not a narrative of punishment, but of covenant, a quiet agreement between a ruler and the guardian of his ancestors. The Sphinx does not threaten with swift wings, it invites with a silent, monumental presence. Its mystery is not one of fear, but of immense, patient age. To stand before it is to feel the weight of time itself, a sensation so profound it can feel like a gentle, awe-inspiring pressure on the soul. The real power of such places lies not in a capacity for harm, but in their ability to quiet our minds, to make us feel small in the face of eternity, and to remind us that some stories are written not in words, but in wind-worn stone and the slow, patient turning of the stars. When Howard Carter first held a flickering candle into that inner chamber, the glimmer that answered him was not from a single piece of gold, but from an entire world of it. He saw, as he later described, strange animals, statues, and gold, everywhere the glint of gold. This was the true heart of the discovery, a burial chamber almost completely untouched by the looters who had emptied every other royal tomb in the valley. For 3,000 years, this room had held its breath, preserving a collection of objects of such serene and breathtaking artistry that they transcend any notion of a curse. The centerpiece was a series of 4 golden shrines, nested one inside the other like a set of intricate Russian dolls, each one covered in beautifully carved hieroglyphs and scenes of gods. They were not just containers, they were a miniature temple built to house the king's spirit. Inside the innermost shrine rested the sarcophagus, a single, magnificent block of quartzite, its corners guarded by goddesses whose outstretched wings seemed to embrace the stone. And within that, the coffins, 3 of them, the final 2 made of solid gold. When the lid of the innermost coffin was lifted, the world finally met the face of Tutankhamun, not as a withered mummy, but as the serene, youthful king immortalized in his death mask. This mask is more than a treasure, it is a masterpiece of the ancient goldsmith's art. made of solid gold inlaid with brilliant blue lapis lazuli, red carnelian, and deep black obsidian. It shows a calm, idealized face, forever young, forever at peace. It is a portrait of a god-king stepping into eternity, his expression holding neither anger nor malice, only a profound and tranquil stillness. Scattered throughout the tomb's chambers were other wonders that spoke of beauty, not fear. Elegant alabaster jars, carved so thin that light glows through their creamy white stone, held the sacred oils and perfumes for the king's journey. There were delicate cosmetic boxes, finely wrought jewelry, and a simple, beautiful lotus chalice, its petals seeming to float on water. These were the possessions of a young man, objects of daily life and royal ritual, all elevated to the highest form of art. To walk through that tomb was not to walk through a chamber of horrors, but through a gallery of unparalleled craftsmanship, a silent, golden symphony created to accompany a soul on its greatest journey. The true wonder is not that these objects were cursed, but that they survived at all, allowing us this intimate, beautiful glimpse into a lost world. The silent form of the young king, once hidden within layers of linen and gold, has now spoken through the quiet hum of modern machines. In the early 21st century, Tutankhamun's mummy was carefully removed from his tomb and placed within a portable CT scanner right there in the Valley of the Kings. For the first time, we could see the pharaoh not as a withered relic, but as a living, breathing human being with a medical history. The scans revealed a slender young man, about 5 feet 6 inches tall, who had likely suffered from a minor case of malaria and a fracture in his left leg. These were not the wounds of a curse, but the ordinary ailments and accidents of a life lived long ago. The most profound revelation, however, came from his DNA. Scientists were able to extract minute samples, creating a genetic map of his family line. This biological detective work showed that his parents were brother and sister, a common practice in royal Egyptian families meant to preserve divine bloodlines, but one that carried a heavy genetic toll. This intimate connection to the past, discovered not by breaking seals but by reading the very code of his life, feels like a peaceful resolution to a centuries-old mystery. We are no longer grave robbers peering into the dark. We are listeners, leaning in to hear a story written in bone and blood. This scientific inquiry becomes a form of respectful communion, a way to understand the boy behind the mask without disturbing the peace he was promised. So let the desert winds sing this final, gentle lullaby. The sands shift and settle over the Valley of the Kings, a soft, golden blanket tucking the cliffs into sleep. In the deep quiet beneath, a young king rests within his golden nest, surrounded not by anger, but by the beautiful, silent music of his treasures. The glitter of gold is the last star in his eternal night. The painted walls are his serene, unchanging sky. The whispers of the curse were never a threat, but a mother's hushed song, a plea for the world to be still, to let dreams reign undisturbed. This is the pharaoh's true peace, a perfect silence woven from 3,000 years of shadow and the patient, breathing darkness. It is a lullaby without a melody, heard only in the absence of sound, in the cool touch of stone and the gentle weight of time. Close your eyes and listen to that quiet. It is the desert remembering. It is the night watching over a boy who became a king, who became a story, and who now at last sleeps on. That ancient warning carved in stone was a spiritual shield, not a weapon. For the Egyptians, the afterlife was a very real and tangible journey, a continuation of the soul's existence in a realm of perfect peace and abundance known as the Field of Reeds. Getting there, however, was a perilous voyage through a dark and unpredictable underworld. The soul had to navigate treacherous waterways, confront chaotic demons, and pass a final judgment where its heart was weighed against the feather of truth. The tomb, therefore, was not a final resting place in our sense of the word. It was a sacred launching point, a carefully provisioned and protected vessel for this most important of journeys. Every single object within it served a vital purpose. The food and wine were sustenance for the spirit. The chariots and bows were for protection and prestige. The spells painted on the walls, known as the Book of the Dead, were a literal guidebook providing the passwords and maps needed to navigate the dangers ahead. The curse itself was the ultimate protective charm, a final layer of defense inscribed at the threshold. It was a plea to the gods and a warning to mortals, all designed to maintain the sacred silence and perfect order, or mat, necessary for the king's spirit to complete its transformation. Think of it as a divine security system, not one of punishment but of preservation. Its purpose was to ensure that the pharaoh's delicate, eternal dreams were never shattered by the noise and light of the living world. It was the deepest expression of a culture's care, a final act of love to ensure a young king's journey into forever would be peaceful, complete, and utterly undisturbed. Tutankhamun was far from alone in his need for a protected slumber. The deep desire to guard sacred rest echoes softly from other tombs throughout the Valley of the Kings. In the magnificent burial place of the great Pharaoh Seti I, for instance, another warning was inscribed. It was a simple yet powerful plea, stating that anyone who would desecrate the tomb would know no peace in life, and their own name would be forgotten for all eternity. This was not a threat of physical death, but of a spiritual one, the erasure of a person's legacy. This theme of protection, of a final, desperate wish for undisturbed peace, is a thread that runs through countless ancient cultures. It is a universal human desire, as natural as grieving itself. We see it in the simple grave markers of common people, asking for the ground to be left untouched. We hear it in the prayers of families everywhere, hoping their loved ones can rest without fear of disturbance. The Egyptian curses were simply the most elaborate and poetic expressions of this fundamental need. They were born from a culture that believed the afterlife was a fragile, ongoing journey, one that required absolute silence and perfect order to succeed. To break that order was to risk a soul becoming lost forever. So when we read these ancient warnings today, we are not reading the angry words of a vengeful spirit. We are listening to the heartfelt voice of a son, a daughter, a priest, or a pharaoh, all sharing the same deep-seated hope that those they loved could sleep in peace, safe from the noise and chaos of the world for all time. The desert night air is cool and impossibly still, a vast dome of silence stretching from horizon to horizon. Above, the stars are not just points of light, but a thick, shimmering dust, so bright and close they feel like a ceiling of diamond chips. This is not the empty silence of a vacant room, but a deep, resonant quiet, the sound of the earth itself holding its breath. For the ancient Egyptians, this was the perfect model for the eternity they sought, a state of unbroken, perfect peace they called the night of time. It was this very desert stillness they hoped to capture and preserve within the sealed walls of the tomb. The cool, dry air that prevents decay, the profound darkness that mimics the womb of the world before creation, the unwavering stars that mark a calendar of millennia, all of these were not just environmental facts. They were the essential ingredients for the pharaoh's eternal sleep. The tomb architects did not build against the desert, they built with it, using the natural world's own perfect preservation to create a house of eternity. Can you feel that quiet, the gentle weight of the centuries pressing down? That is the peace they wanted, a slumber so deep and so secure that not even the turning of the ages could stir the sleeper. It is a silence you can almost touch, a blanket of timeless dark woven from starlight and sand, forever guarding the dreams of kings. So if the curse was not a supernatural force, what was it? The simplest answer is often the most overlooked, the quiet, unremarkable rhythm of human life and death itself. Let us look at the facts with a gentle and logical eye. Lord Carnarvon was 56 years old when he died, and he was not a healthy man. For decades he had suffered from a chronic respiratory condition, his lungs weakened and vulnerable. In an age before antibiotics, a simple mosquito bite leading to a blood infection was a serious and often fatal medical event. His death, while tragic, was a predictable outcome given his frail health and the limited medicine of his time. Then consider the others. George Good was in his late 50s and already quite ill when he decided to travel to Egypt. Arthur Mace had been complaining of exhaustion and illness for years, his body worn down by the long, arduous labor of the excavation. Archibald Reed, the radiologist, succumbed to a disease known to be caused by prolonged, unprotected exposure to X-ray radiation, a tragic occupational hazard for early practitioners. When you step back and look at the entire group of people involved with the tomb, from its discovery through the next decade, a clear picture emerges. Of the 26 Westerners present at the opening of the tomb or the burial chamber, only 6 had died within a decade. The vast majority, including Howard Carter himself, lived to a ripe old age. In any random group of 24 people in the 1920s, it would be statistically normal for several to pass away over a 10-year period due to illness, accident, or simply old age. The human mind, however, is a storyteller. It connects the dots between these few sad events and weaves them into a pattern that feels intentional and ominous. We remember the deaths that fit the narrative and forget the many more that do not. The curse is a story of selective memory where coincidence is mistaken for causation, and the ordinary, sad facts of mortality are transformed into a legend of supernatural revenge. There is a strange comfort in a curse, for it suggests a world where death has a reason and a rhyme, a directed purpose. The truth is both simpler and more profound. These were not victims of a pharaoh's wrath. They were simply people living their lives and, in the natural course of time, meeting their ends. So let this story settle around you now like a soft, warm blanket. A single step was found in the desert, leading down into a perfect, silent darkness. A man held a candle to the breach and saw the glint of gold, a world untouched for 3,000 years. A warning was whispered from the stone, a plea for peace, not a threat of vengeance. A canary sang, a serpent came, and a story was born from the sand. A lord passed away from a tiny mosquito bite, and the newspapers sang a song of a curse, a tale of swift wings and doom. We looked for answers in the dust of the tomb, in the invisible flight of ancient spores, in the faint hum of radioactive paint. We saw the power of our own minds, how a story we believe can write itself upon our bodies, and we found at the very heart of it all not a monster but a boy. A young king with a broken leg who loved his games and his bows, whose rest was guarded by the most beautiful, silent treasures. The curse was never magic. It was a lullaby carved in stone to guard a sacred sleep. A lullaby sung by newspapers to a world hungry for mystery. A lullaby we tell ourselves even now, a gentle story of history, not horror. So just breathe, let the golden mask fade in your mind, let the desert winds hush, let the story become soft and quiet, a distant echo from a house of eternity, where a king dreams on in perfect, peaceful silence. May the quiet mystery of the Pharaohs be a gentle companion for your own rest tonight. Thank you for listening and sharing in this peaceful journey to a house of eternity. We wish you a night of deep and tranquil sleep filled with serene dreams. If you would like to drift into more sleepy stories, we welcome you to softly subscribe for our next tale. Good night.